Hi guys, and thanks for tuning in to another episode of Design and a Half. In this episode, we're going to be talking about a large scale versus small scale design, and especially its influence in organizations. Now, digging a bit into this theme, what is large versus small scale design? What are we talking about here? So when I mean small scale, I mean companies which are not bigger than 200 or 300 employees, and design is not necessarily staple there. It's just something that is being done, but it's not being pursued at an executive level. The level of commitment at an executive level is considerably smaller than in larger organizations. And when we're talking about large-scale designs, we're definitely talking about companies which have a significant number of employees and where design has a special place, as well as dedicated personnel like design executives. They have more product owners, more product managers, more UX designers, more visual designers. They have a design strategy, whereas in smaller companies these things rarely happen, mostly because smaller companies have different objectives for them. And so the difference between these two types of organization, small scale versus large scale, is basically the scope as well as the budget, if you want to. Large-scale organizations typically have a lot of cash at their disposal to invest into design per se, as well as invest into specialty design, if you want to. For example, they will be able to hire copywriters, they will be able to hire UX designers in parallel with the specialty designers like visual designers, instead of, or as opposed to small scale organizations where they are going to be mostly hiring people which are largely unicorns or full stack, if you will, which is another trait which is specific to small scale design, if you want to. Additionally, in smaller scale companies, what usually ends up happening is that design is not traditionally seen as it doesn't have a strategic goal overall. It's not into the roadmap. It's not something the company is consciously pursuing when they're talking about product. They're just doing it because they need to. It's sort of like a sanity thing instead of a business objective per se. Whereas in larger organizations, they consciously do this because they understand the value of good design in a product environment. That's one of the main differences. Additionally to understanding the value of good design into larger organizations, what they usually have is a different business need as opposed to the small scale organization. So let's talk a little bit about this. What do I mean by saying this? Well, large scale organizations usually have large objectives, large projects, large enterprises, and that means that their design needs are going to be different than the smaller companies. That's why they invest a lot in design. They usually also invest in a lot of training for their designers, and they are also using tools like road mapping tools, project management tools that are specific only for design purposes, just to track that progress going forward, as well as to keep an eye out on what the teams are doing. They are very invested into design in terms of turning it into a success story for the company. Whereas in the smaller companies, things are a little bit more simple in the sense that design is needed, but it's not necessarily consciously done. Sort of, it's being done just because they need to do it. And that means that the budgets are going to be comparably smaller than the large scale organizations, which means that, for example, a lot of designers going into smaller companies are going to be always complaining about education budgets being small. They're usually going to complain about the fact that they cannot implement very traditional design methods and design processes into smaller companies, mostly because those smaller companies have a different need. This is something I'm actually quite familiar with, and it's something which I've seen along my career quite a long time, and I've grown sort of accustomed to it in a sense. The thing is that we as designers are sort of owned to become this perfection beings that are trying to create something which is increasingly more close to perfection. And the problem with that is it introduces us to a mindset that is very very toxic for us. Why? Because simply put, it means that everything we do is going to try to come out perfect, and that's just not realistic. First of all, it's not realistic from a business perspective. Why? Well, simply because every business is going to need to ship something out. It's not going to be there's not going to be a need for perfection as much as there's going to be a need for release. Why? Because a product that's shipped is far superior to a product that's perfect. That's the problem. And usually what happens is that products that get shipped most of the times are the ones which win against products which are perfect, because those perfect products are perfect in a vacuum, if you will. So this is why iterative design is quite important, and actually having an iterative mindset is very beneficial to us as designers, as well as, for example, educating people which are doing design critique to not necessarily look at design into this perfect light and seeing it as something which needs to come out perfect in a sense, and quite the opposite way. I would say design needs to be good enough to fit the purpose and to solve the problem, while not eating up too much time so that the product gets actually delivered, which sort of is not that it's not a popular mindset, nor is it a popular opinion, because most designers and fellows of mine usually go by the idea that things need to really be perfect when you ship them out. And I actually was of the same opinion when I was younger as well, and I thought things really need to be perfect when they get out. But it's not always the case. It's not always the case when you're talking about smaller organizations. When you're talking about big organizations, that actually depends. It depends if that perfect thing that gets taken and released fits within the scope of the company, fits within the scope of the project, fits within the budget of the company. Are there enough people to do that? Can we achieve that in the given time span? Is it something which is realistic? Is it something which is desired? There's a lot of questions which need to be asked before committing to something which is perfect, at least from my point of view. But getting back to the discussion at hand, what we are saying is that shipped is better than perfect, which is absolutely friggin' true in all situations when we're talking about software development. And this is the thing that designers need to actually understand. We need to let go of perfection in order to be able to embrace what is possible. That's the thing. This is where we actually need to be. Also, talking about perfect versus done, I wanted to touch upon the subject of design education with regards to small versus large scale organizations. So one of the things that I really wanted to point out was that in contrast to small organizations, large organizations have a lot of funds that are dedicated to educating their personnel, especially their designers, but also product owners and developers and testers and whatnot. But since we're talking about design, I'll just mention designers in this case. So they have a lot of money to spend on education, and this usually leads that these designers perfect a lot of their processes and have a lot of leeway to create perfect processes, or at least processes which are close to perfection within those companies. And when they leave those companies, what ends up usually happening is that they might be joining a smaller company, and in that particular situation drama ensues, because designers usually want to get into the same comfort of earlier, where they were part of a larger process where everything was really neatly sliced down, and people knew what they were doing, and so on and so forth. Whereas in smaller companies, things are a little bit more hectic, more chaotic, and this is not necessarily just out of ill intent, but because of how small companies operate. So think about the fact that if you have a small budget, you don't have enough money to hire 2 or 3 product owners, you don't have enough money to hire 3 or 4 product designers or UX designers, and that means that corners are going to be cut, definitely. So that's just a given. And in that situation, when corners are cut, things don't turn out perfect in the sense of a project. They are being done so that everything gets shipped and stuff is being done, but not perfectly, which is sort of in contradiction with the mindset of designers, as I just mentioned earlier, that are coming from larger companies. In addition to that, well, what ends up happening is that, say you've invested a lot in your education as a designer, what could happen is you could probably feel very, very frustrated that you cannot actually implement all of what you just learned into this new company where you're working, because that as much as you want to, you cannot sort of push the company to grow as fast as you want it to, so that you're able to implement all of those changes that are necessary to catch up your older company from behind, in a sense, because that's what you're sort of actually trying to do in your head. You're just trying to catch up from where you left off, to be able to get a sense of comfort in your position, in a way. That's what happens. That being said, I would really love to know what your opinion is on small versus large scale design. So if you're interested, or if you want to, you can use the YouTube channel to leave me a comment, or drop a like on the video if you liked it. Definitely subscribe if you think the information I provide is worthy for you. And please tell me what you think about smaller versus large scale organizations in terms of design, what your experience with those with those companies was, and what your general thoughts are about this. Like, how do you feel about design in a small team environment and a small company versus a larger company? How do you feel it's working for you? Do you see what are the main challenges that you're facing, and would you like me to talk about it in the future video, about one of those challenges? What do you guys think? Another thing I wanted to mention about while talking about large versus small scale design is about your career path as a designer. And this is sort of the touchy subject in a lot of situations, because in small companies, what ends up happening is that your career path is sort of ramping up, but it plateaus at a certain point, just because you won't be able to progress further due to the fact that the company being small, you would need to either become super specialized or just go in towards management. And since companies that are small rarely are looking to promote a person which is a good designer into a management position, because they would end up losing someone which is delivering consistently, which in turn means that they will most likely keep you as a designer exactly as you are right now, and probably just hire from outside if they really need to. So the biggest issue with smaller companies is always going to be a career path in a way. The problem with larger companies in a way, with regards to this respect, is the fact that in a lot of situations, what ends up happening is that you'll have to jump through a lot of hoops to be able to get to the point where you're switching careers and then being promoted to a higher position. And sometimes it's not necessarily about the salary as much as it's about being recognized for what you do, and more than being recognized for what you do, it's about getting more responsibilities and getting to grow more in a different direction that you're currently used to growing. But what about you as a designer, for example? Let's say you're the type of person that wants to work in a work environment where people are nice and decent, and you feel like you're important. What would you think you would choose? Would you choose a larger company? Would you choose a smaller company? I would be really interested to know what your opinions are, so please write them in the comments box on YouTube if you want to. I would highly appreciate an answer from you guys. This is sort of a discussion that is always more or less philosophical. Why? Because some people enjoy working in a highly busy environment that large companies offer, which is collaborative. It's energetic. It feels like there's always something happening. There's always something going on. But at the same time, from personal experience, it's always distracting in a way. And it feels like if you're the type of person that wants to get their stuff done and is very conscientious about their job, they're always trying to sort of check stuff off from their list. This is going to feel very busy for you, and at some point it's going to wear you out. From my experience, at least this is my case. However, in smaller companies, there's a different thing. You might experience a similar situation with the business just because of the fact that smaller companies, being so small and being so tight in terms of how many people there are and the community sense, there's always going to be something to be done, and there's always going to be a sensation that you're behind with work. Whereas in a larger company, depending obviously on the larger company, you might feel more relaxed at certain times because your position might be covered. For example, if you are a UX designer and you're going into a vacation, for example, you're going to be okay because your position is going to be covered by a fellow colleague. Whereas in a smaller company, if you're the only designer, well, basically you need to be very careful about how you plan your vacation, not to impede release schedules or product development cycles and so on, which is sort of a drawback, if you want to, about being in a smaller company as opposed to a bigger one. Running this idea a little bit further, I'm just going to compare for a little bit the two sort of example companies, the large one versus small one, in terms of teams of design. So one major advantage in a smaller company is the fact that you know the person that you're working with, and most of the times you're going to be trust them really well, and work sort of well with each other. And as opposed to in a larger company, there's always going to be a little bit of friction between colleagues, just because different colleagues have different objectives, they have agendas. Transparency is somewhat not as okay as in smaller companies. And on the other hand, on the plus side, the cool thing about large companies is the fact that you'll always have a lot of people who you can reference to or talk to for a good opinion on a specific subject, especially on design or whatever it is. And that's something which you will never have in a small company. What usually happens is, in a smaller company you might have 2 or 3 colleagues, and that's about it. So if you really want specific insight, you might need to refer to a community of designers or some friends of yours who are also working as designers, rather than, I don't know, relying on your colleagues. This is another sort of a disadvantage if you're working in a smaller company as a designer. But what about design processes? I know I mentioned them earlier at the beginning of the podcast, and I just wanted to circle back around the subject because I think it's really, really important to mention it. Processes in smaller companies are usually tighter and have fewer steps because time to production needs to be faster, as opposed to larger companies where you have sort of slower time to production due to the fact that certainty and quality needs to be considerably higher than a smaller companies, due to the fact that the larger companies' image, branding, or net promoter score is at stake. And that means that the larger company has the affordance of being able to have a longer cycle of development and of processes, as opposed to a smaller one. For example, in design, what usually happens is that you have an ideation phase, you have a sketching and wireframing phase, you have a testing phase, and afterwards you have an implementation phase where usually you do some usability testing at the end after stuff gets implemented. So there's a fair bit of testing involved into the ideal scenario. But in a small company, that usually does not happen, out of two main reasons, and that's out of personal experience. What I'm about to say. One is about the money. First of all, user testing is quite expensive in some ways, especially if you're doing it with people outside your house. So if you're doing it with external users, that's usually going to cost you quite a bit of money. First of all, you need to recruit people, then you need to incentivize people, and then you need to gift people after completing your user testing, which is quite sizable in terms of what it means as a sum. Then you also need to invest into interviewing tools, if you will. So you need to actually have a good fair budget for tools in your company if you want to introduce user testing as well, because it's really not cheap at all. You need to have at least some InVision to be able to add your visual designs there, discuss them, maybe the wireframes. You need to have at least a Zeppelin or InVision is fine. If you don't want to get Zeppelin, InVision is just fine, because you also have code there. But you need to have some sort of transition from visual design into code, and that's what I mentioned earlier about InVision and Zeppelin. Then you also need to have a platform for user testing, like userinterviews.com, or anything that helps you pool all of the people that you've used together and helps you reference them back at a later point if you need to get back to them with more information and more questions. Then there's also the question of what type of research are you going to do. Secondly, there's the question of what do you want to find out. First of all, that's the most important question. So what do you want to find out? And are you prepared to act upon what you find out? Do you afford to act upon it? Do you afford to prolong your process to be able to fix what you just found out in the user testing phase? Is it okay? Does it fit your company? And those are all sort of questions that people usually don't ask themselves, but they end up just going with user designers forward, and then they end up hiring a lot of or end up hiring user experience designers just to figure out and end up understanding that they can't afford to actually do proper testing, and they can't afford to actually understand the problem behind. Why? Because when you're actually aware of the problem, you might be tempted to actually fix it, or you might be you should be actually tempted to fix it, because that's the main reason to actually do user testing. The problem is some people just find out they can't do that because they don't have the funds, they don't have the time, or they don't have the funds because they don't have the time, something along those lines. However, don't think that in larger companies things are just peachy in these terms of user testing and UX design, because in some ways larger companies have different problems with budgeting. What I mean by that is the fact that it takes considerably longer for a budget to be approved in a larger company as it is in a smaller one. So in a sense, if you're able to convince your VP of engineering, your CTO, CEO, whatever you want, that user testing is important and he needs to give you that money to be able to user test, then you might be better off in a smaller company than in a bigger one, because in a bigger one you will have considerably more steps to go through to be able to convince a person that has authority over a budget to spend money on something. And that's a huge minus point from my point of view about larger organizations. For example, if you need to buy a specific tool, you need Sketch. You don't like Adobe XD anymore, and you just want to switch to Sketch. What ends up happening in a larger company is you have to do to create a business case for that particular application. You have to present a case why you just want to switch that tool, how much is going to cost, what the benefits are going to be, is it going to ease up your work, and so on and so forth. And those are sort of things that in a smaller company might not necessarily happen as often as in bigger companies, or they might actually happen in smaller companies. It actually, this part depends a lot on the company where you're working. Okay, wrapping up, I would like to thank you all for sticking around with me for almost half an hour, and to hearing me out ramble about small versus large scale design. And I hope you'll tune in next time for my next episode, which I hope it's going to be next week. Thanks guys, and have a great evening.